welcome to this episode of 15 Minutes With. I'm Pete Fleming, the head of product and UX design here at Chariot Solutions. And the topic we're going to be discussing is how developers create better software when they partner with designers. And our guest today is Tom Purcell. Tom is one of Chariot's own very talented consultants and an all-around super nice guy. I'm not just saying that because he always brings donuts to the office on Friday, you know, when the office was a thing. So let's jump in. Welcome, Tom. How are you?
Doing great, Pete. How about you?
I'm doing all right, So before we jump right in and talk about the specifics of the topic of the day, do you want to give us a little bit of background about yourself?
Sure. I've been doing software since 1985. So I've gone through a number of waves of software architectures, platforms, things of that nature. Started out on IBM mainframes, worked on those through the 90s, then got into Java and application servers, WebLogic, Tomcat, into Spring and Spring Boot. Worked through the SOA environment and those days, and now most recently I've gotten into the IoT world, where we're talking Java mainframe, Java backends to devices out in the wild on the internet, and also more recently actually some Python as well. So
maybe it would have been faster to list the things you haven't worked on.
Yeah, I've done an awful lot of stuff over the years. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that's why your perspective on today's topic is going to be hugely helpful, because you've done and seen a lot, I think. So let's kick it off and talk about, if you can just talk a little bit about your perspective. What do you think the role of design is in the software world? Let's start real high level, real abstract.
Well, at its base, what we try to do is solve customers' problems. Client comes to us with an idea on how they want to do something, or an issue that they're having a problem with, and they come to us. They want us to help them solve that problem. And the tools that someone like myself, a developer, brings to the table are technical tools to address a business problem. But there is a gap there, right? The client is thinking in terms of their day-to-day business and how they do things. I'm thinking in terms of how to solve that problem from a technical perspective. We speak different languages, and so it's important to have someone in that can translate between the two different concerns. Where I see design coming in is actually doing that translation. A good designer is familiar with the proper tools to lay out an approach to a business problem in a graphical way that a user can see and touch and feel and see what it's going to look like, and so that a developer can look at that same view, and that you can have a conversation where we come to an agreement on the path, on the direction the product should take.
Okay. Yeah, I love that, the concept of the gap between what clients or stakeholders need and what developers need, and designers filling that sort of translator role in between, which is a little bit different than, you know, what design is traditionally thought of in a lot of places as just the make it pretty people.
Well, you know, and the other thing too, I would say too, is that the make it pretty part is important, because again,
Yeah,
I'm going to tell you, I'm a technical person, and I am good with things like loops and if statements, but you don't really want me to design like your color scheme or something like that. I just don't have look at my background.
Yeah.
I just don't have a feel for that sort of thing, right? A good designer can, first of all, knows how to do that sort of thing, and what colors to convey and stuff like that, but also in terms of layout of a screen and everything else like that, what works for an end user in terms of using a particular GUI.
Yeah.
and they can address those things that make it appealing to a user. Whereas, quite frankly, I'm not sure if I'm capable of doing that. If you give me a layout that you want me to support, and I can do that. I can look
Yeah.
at that and say, okay, well, this widget needs this REST endpoint, and I can do this in the background, and this button has to do this thing, right? But in terms of laying that out and driving that conversation between a client and the developer side, I think that's where design comes in and comes into play.
In the development world, we spend a lot of our time and energy talking about the value that design brings to businesses, which is super duper important. But I think more germane for this conversation today here is, what benefits have you seen firsthand that's helped you with your job, or helped in any way in your world? What benefits have you seen from working with designers?
Well, I think one of the things that is good is that some of the more modern design tools allow the designer to develop a clickable prototype, okay? So what that does is it puts a thing in front of the user that they can see how their business process is going to flow through the system, okay? Which is great for conversation between the client and the developers, with the designer there, to go through that process to make sure that both sides of the equation understand what the process is supposed to accomplish, and the most fluid way to address that process. Because you can describe that. I can describe it. It's typical when two people describe a process, they both walk away with different expectations.
Right.
Come up with some concrete flow, right, that everyone's agreed upon, then it can save a lot of time and effort on the development side, because, okay, this is what the user wants, right? And this is what we're going to do. And so it eliminates those things where there might be some gap in understanding between the client and the developers. And you can move through that. You can develop to that with in a much more efficient way. The other thing too is what invariably happens, even with design in place, a designer in place doing that. At some point, you might come to a point in the development cycle where there still is a gap, but with the design in place, it's very easy to go back to the client and say, you know what, we ran into this issue. We have an additional question. How do we fill in this gap, right? We can address that before we actually get to the end point, and we're about to go to production and we find that we have a gap. We've found out the gap way sooner in the process, which makes the development process more efficient.
Right. So throughout the course of your career, you've worked on, you talked about all the different technologies, but I'm sure you've also worked on projects of all sorts, shapes, and sizes. I'm sure there have been times where you've had zero support from a design team, as well as projects where you've worked with design that was integrated very well into the development. So can you just talk a little bit about the differences you've seen and how those projects have gone when there have been those differences in design support?
Yeah, I guess in a way I'll just reiterate something I've just said, but maybe amplify it a little bit. The thing is, okay, so in the past where I've worked in a situation where there hasn't been design in place or a clickable prototype or something that the user could see, when a client is thinking about their problem space and how to address what they do on a daily basis, right? There are things that they'll explain to you, right? There are also things, and I think we all as human beings do this. We are familiar with something, right? And so when we describe it to somebody else, we may leave out something that is, to us, obvious.
Right.
I'll take a sports analogy. The best athletes make the worst coaches.
Yeah.
They can't tell you how to do what they do because it's like, well, you just do it.
Yeah.
Yes, Joe Montana, how to throw a football. Well, you throw it. What part of throw it don't you understand? And I think that happens a lot in terms of describing a business problem, okay? And so what happens in those cases is you get, you have a client describing something, and then without design being in place, I go off and I go ahead and I build a system, and then on the day we're supposed to go to production or UAT or whatever, right? The client says, well, what about X?
Yeah.
And I say, well, you never mentioned X. And the client's, well, you have to have X, right? And that's because it was like, oh, you just throw it. Everybody knows you just throw it, you know?
Right.
And that's the type of thing where if you have that clickable prototype going through, and the client can see that X is missing, right? They can say, well, what about X? Long before we started off on a long, arduous development project and find out on day zero that X is missing.
Yeah, I think one of the areas where design isn't usually typically thought of, at least from the client side or from the stakeholder subject matter expert side, is the figuring out that minutia, figuring out the details, doing the critical thinking, going beyond the surface level of the feature that seems really obvious. Just add a checkbox here, to thinking about all the implications. Well, what effect does that have on the other screens and that type of thing? You know, one of the hats I think that designers wear is the requirements wrangler. Maybe I'll trademark that. But tell us about what can be challenging about working with designers, either when you've worked with some designers that are not great for one reason or another, or even if they're good designers, but it still brings up a challenge for you.
Well, first of all, Pete, I'd just like to say that all designers are marvelous. That being said, okay, I have had situations here and there where a designer may go down a path and design, introduce a widget onto a GUI design that is simple on its face, but given the guts of the system that work, the way things work in the background, is very difficult to deliver on, okay? Because again, the good thing about a clickable design is it's fast and easy to get something in front of the client. The bad thing about a clickable design is that it's fast and easy to get something in front of the client. And so it can be a situation where maybe it's over-promised. There is a developer I've worked with in the past who's used the term, written the check that we can't cash.
Right.
I don't know, maybe you've met him. Anyway, anyway, so that can be a problem. But what that really is just, again, another one of those gaps that we're talking about. Okay. Yeah. And so the thing about that is it's just a question of, okay, if we need to accomplish that, can we, first, one question is, okay, if that needs to happen, then is it something that needs to happen day one, or is it something that we can address in a subsequent release? If it needs to be there in day one, well, can we accomplish that in a slightly different way that will introduce less technical complexity?
Right.
But the thing is, again, it's one of those things, even in that bad case, right? It's something we're discovering up front rather than down the road. Again, it all has to do with filling in the gaps, right? And so there are three different places where we have gaps. We have gaps coming from the client, gaps coming from the developer, or gaps coming from the designer, right? Yeah. And so the thing is, if the three of those communities, so to speak, can get together in a meeting, right? Look at what's there, right? We can all discover where our gaps are. We can discuss them up front, and we can devise ways to address those. But again, it exposes things, it gets it out on the table, and we can come up with, we can together work as a solution, client, designer, developer.
All right, Tom, believe it or not, our time is up. We've flown through our 15 minutes, as is usually the case when I have conversations with you. Time flies. It's been really great stuff, and I just want to thank you for your time. And I'm looking forward to Donut Fridays back in the office.
Oh, you know, by the way, I drove past that bakery today, and today was the first day they were open again since March.
Oh, all right. So
Yeah,
back to the office next week then.
I went in, got some cinnamon buns. Everything's good.
Great. Thank you, Tom.